I would first like to give the floor to Laurence Carvalho from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research that will talk about the nature-based solutions for lakes, or lakes as solutions. Laurence, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Konstantina. Screen up. Okay. Thanks very much to the World Water Quality Alliance for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to just start with some of the few concepts really behind nature-based solutions, and I guess answer a bit the question that's posed in this whole webinar. But I also want to think about whether we're talking about nature-based solutions for lakes, or whether lakes themselves can be considered a nature-based solution. So just to start with a couple of definitions of nature-based solution. There's many definitions out there, but I think in particular the top one is probably the most widely used definition from the IUCN. And but both this and the one below, which is from the European Commission, have certain elements that are common to them both. And one is that nature-based solutions are about protecting biodiversity and restoring biodiversity, but they also must be about addressing societal challenges. So it's both really simultaneously restoring nature or protecting nature and delivering these benefits to society. And in the framing of these documents that talk about the definitions, the big societal challenge they're talking about there really is the climate crisis and delivering adaptation or mitigation measures in relation to climate change, as well as the biodiversity crisis. But obviously there are other societal challenges, major societal challenges out there, and one is to do with water supply and water quality. That's illustrated in this figure. So just the classic examples of nature-based solutions, well, probably the most obvious one that we're all familiar with comes from terrestrial world, and that's planting trees and replanting forests. And so as well as obviously recreating new forest habitat, it's all about locking up carbon. The type of tree is really important in that. Obviously, planting an oil palm plantation or a conifer forest, conifer plantation isn't necessarily enhancing biodiversity too much. So there are aspects of the quality of the biodiversity, I think, that are important when considering whether it's a nature-based solution. More from the aquatic world, equivalent to the forests on terrestrial land are the kelp forests underwater in the marine environment. And again, with the same sort of purposes of restoring this important habitat, underwater habitat for fisheries and for biodiversity more generally, but also locking up carbon. And finally, an example from the Netherlands. This is the Room for the Rivers programme on the Rhine. And this is really about restoring and recreating floodplain wetland habitat, which has been lost widely across landscapes, but allowing then the rivers to flood into these as a sort of measure against climate mitigation or adding climate resilience. So those are sort of three sort of often widely cited measures of nature-based solutions. So the question is whether it's a sort of new jargon that we're talking about, or whether it's just an umbrella concept. And to be honest, personally, I don't really mind whether it's either, but I think it certainly does overlap with some sort of former concepts that, or former terms we used to use. So ecosystem-based adaptation, for example, I would say is probably more or less synonymous with nature-based solutions. You could potentially say that green infrastructure, again, is quite synonymous, but that probably depends how natural or modified the infrastructure is. This is an example on the right of a constructed wetland in northern India. And the question is that a nature-based solution? And it probably depends how that wetland developed and is managed, but in my mind, it doesn't really matter. There's going to be a gradient between green infrastructure projects that are clearly much more engineered and more natural systems that are managed for a particular purpose. And then even the concept of ecosystem services does overlap in some way to nature-based solutions, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, and whether, I guess, it's a passive or active management maybe distinguishes it. But again, I'm not too worried. I think the usefulness of it is it's relatively understood by the public, the term a nature-based solution, whereas something like ecosystem-based adaptation does sound even more technical jargon to me than nature-based solution. So I've got a quiz now to start this meeting off, and we're not going to necessarily ask for answers in the chat, but it's just a bit of fun to get you thinking about it. So I've got 3 examples, and I wondered whether you can think about whether they're a nature-based solution. So the first one is planting genetically modified crops to use less water. So is that a nature-based solution? The second one, creating a rainwater garden, or which could be a wetland habitat, grassland habitat, but it's aimed to prevent flooding and potentially even improve water quality. Or the third one, which is my favorite nature-based solution, which is damming a river to create a lake, or really a reservoir for flood control, water supply and energy security. So we can maybe have some comment on that in the discussion at the end, but clearly some of these aren't really about restoring biodiversity. Some of these aren't necessarily tackling what you would call a major societal challenge. And even the third one, there's questions. As a lake ecologist, I'm quite happy with creating lake habitat rather than river habitat, but there are other issues about land use and inclusion as well that are all, when you look at what is a nature-based solution, are important. So it's not a straightforward term. It can be quite vague as to what a societal challenge is, what's inspired by nature or what's natural, but I don't think we should worry about it too much. So just some examples of potentially what we could call nature-based solutions for lake restoration, and I'm just going to highlight them because I know some of the other speakers have got a lot more to say about these. The first one is a technique that wasn't called nature-based solutions when we really started developing it in the 1980s, and that's biomanipulation, where one example of that is manipulating the fish communities in lakes. So, for example, piscivorous fish, like this pike here, eat zooplanktivorous fish, and therefore reduce the grazing pressure on zooplankton, and that can help manage water quality and reduce algal blooms. Other types of biomanipulation could be directly encouraging plant communities, submerged plants. Another example is more in the catchment, and that's about creating wetlands in the catchment to store water, to filter pollutants. And those wetlands could be engineered or created using machinery, but they could be, in this example, created maybe even more nature-based if they're created passively by beaver reintroductions. And thirdly, a third example is one we're probably quite familiar with, which is riparian buffer strips, which can be targeted for reducing nutrient inputs, but particularly, I guess, they are focused on reducing erosion and trapping sediments coming off agricultural fields. And again, I think Mike's going to be talking about the efficacy of that measure in his talk. But I think another important thing to think about, or at least mention, is that, and this is actually, if you look at the IUCN document on nature-based solutions, they're not talking about this being the only approach to lake restoration, but about integrating nature-based solutions with other solutions. And I've just highlighted some important other types of solutions here. So clearly, technical solutions are really fundamental to many lake restoration programs, having good wastewater treatment and ideally taking that into tertiary levels of treatment to reduce nutrient concentrations and potentially recover the nutrients from the wastewater. Second example here, and I think a really important area for further development are circular economy solutions, where it could be about recovering phosphorus from lake sediments. It could be about harvesting algae and plants or fish and getting resources back from those. And thirdly, solutions don't need to be nature-based. They don't need to be circular economy solutions, especially. They don't need to be technical. They could just be about restoring habitat for freshwater biodiversity. As you can see, this really nice example from the Markerwadden in the Netherlands. So what, again, the IUCN have developed a framework for the design and verifying whether a nature-based solution is likely to deliver an impactful outcome. And this isn't just about the technical efficacy of the solution, but it addresses many more dimensions. And you can see there's 8 criteria for whether a nature-based solution is an effective approach to undertake. And that includes whether it's economically viable, whether communities are involved in the design and the implementation and are empowered by the approach, and also whether its design takes into account the scale needed for a nature-based solution. It's a really nice framework, and it's in a way an approach used to evaluate whether a nature-based solution is really a nature-based solution, or whether potentially it could be just greenwashing by a company calling it a nature-based solution. It has to really tick the boxes on these criteria to be considered really truly a nature-based solution that is there for everyone. And based around that IUCN gold standard, I've been involved in an EU project, European project called Merlin, where we've been trying to develop a framework for monitoring the impacts of nature-based solutions. And based on that fact that we're not trying to just look at the biodiversity impacts or benefits or the climate adaptation and mitigation benefits, but we should also be thinking about the benefits to economic benefits and the societal benefits in that. And we should even be thinking about trade-offs with important sectors such as food production and energy production. Do the solutions have negative effects on those sectors? And there's a reference to this in the white paper on sustainable lake management. So just so quickly, some questions about just highlighting some knowledge gaps. We're still sort of trying to understand how effective nature-based solutions are, how different contexts affect their both their uptake or implementation. Those could be social or governance contexts or catchment contexts, and also how that affects potentially their effectiveness, whether that effectiveness is sustained over the longer term, and whether they are resilient to climate change themselves. So there are really many areas of research needed to really support further mainstreaming of nature-based solutions in lake restoration. So getting onto the sort of the final part of my talk really is just to say, well, what about lakes themselves? Some people talk about lakes as nature-based solutions, and delivering services that tackle societal challenges. And you can see a landscape from southern Eastern Africa here. We've got Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika at the top. But just showing that the lakes are very important features in the landscape that potentially can be managed to tackle societal challenges. And I just wanted to talk about two examples of that. Firstly, lakes, the role of lakes in water purification and potentially in nutrient recovery. There's a really nice paper on thinking about lakes across a landscape and designing smart nutrient retention networks to consider how we both reduce pollutants, but also can potentially recapture the nutrients from lakes in these networks. And you can read more about that in paper by Dianica, Vic and others. But what they do highlight, and we've seen some global studies that really show the potential for both recovering nitrogen and phosphorus in lakes and the purification processes that go on in lake basins. Similarly, lakes are overlooked, I would say, in policy terms, in terms of their carbon sequestration potential. They're really, one aspect of that is because the IPCC tends to think about changing the quantity of habitats, changing the amount of forestry, the amount of kelp forest, the amount of salt marsh, or the amount of peatland. And that's how we can enhance or decrease carbon sequestration. I think it's really important that we talk more loudly about how actually it's how you manage lakes can actually affect their role as an important source of, or an important sink for carbon in the landscape. And really this, we're talking about with deep lakes, long-term burial of carbon, functioning very much as sort of deep ocean sediments as well. And that's not just for carbon absorbing CO2 directly from algae in the water, but also terrestrial carbon coming in. They can play a role in sequestering that as well. And there's a really nice modelling study looking about the amount of organic carbon that is buried in lakes globally, at lakes and reservoirs globally across the world, highlighting the importance of it. And I just wanted to illustrate that with a nice study that I was involved with a couple of a group at the A-Tree in Bengaluru in India. And you can see the picture here of Sumita, who's in this webinar, and Priyanka, who leads that group in A-Tree, where we compared actually the amount of carbon emitted from two lakes, one that received a lot of untreated sewage effluent, and one where that effluent was treated both at a sewage works, but also in a nature-based solution in a wetland basin before it went into the lake. And the amount of emissions between the two sites was incredible, really. 3 orders of magnitude of carbon emitted from the untreated effluent. So it really does highlight how we can actually manage some of these services or to tackle societal challenges. And so just finally to say, lakes as nature-based solutions themselves, I think it's not the lake that's the nature-based solution, it's how we manage our lakes. And that comes back to this whole concept of sustainable lake management, not just for the lake itself, but potentially for tackling societal challenges. And this nice diagram again from Dianica's PhD or paper. What really highlights is that it's important that we understand the context of how we can do that, how we can use lakes themselves as nature-based solutions. We need to think about the state of the lake, the type of lake, the catchment characteristics, and the type of management intervention. And with that sort of greater understanding, we can start developing lakes as nature-based solutions themselves. And I'll leave it there, Konstantina. That's everything.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Brian, do we have any questions for Laurence?
I'm coming, Konstantina, coming. There's some questions that are being addressed in the chat. I think probably there was just having a look down there. I think most of them are being answered in the chat. There was a statement actually that came through from Lucy Lucy Gillis on the chat, which I think is probably, we can rephrase as a question for Laurence, which is about the context through which we consider nature-based solutions. So the statement was maybe the answers to your quiz might be different depending on your discipline. I've heard dams termed as nature-based solutions. So Laurence, I wonder if you can sort of give us your perspectives on how we set the context for nature-based solutions within watershed or across scales, if we're focusing on lakes.
I mean, I think it's correct to say it will depend on your context and your perspective. I think if we use some aspects of that IUCN definition, though, it has got to be a bit really truly about biodiversity restoration, probably even more so than biodiversity protection, as well as the societal challenge. And then you need to think about, you know, so I was being obviously a bit ironic or facetious with dammed reservoirs being a nature-based solution, but in some ways they could fit that definition. I mean, I think we just have to think of these, make sure that these things aren't being used in policy or more in greenwashing terms, or being used in a way to argue for things that aren't really beneficial to the environment, that they do address both challenges.
Yeah.
So I don't have a definitive answer, but
yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fine. There is another question which is really interesting, which is about how you implement nature-based solutions into urban environments where the infrastructure is already established.
yeah, so I mean, I guess that's where the concept has been used more widely, as in urban environments, and that's why it does overlap quite a bit with green infrastructure. But so I think urban environments are very important areas because they are partly depauperate in nature, and it's really important, I think, for many reasons, but for health and well-being reasons, one thing, that people have access to nature and high quality nature. And so I think regreening our cities is important, and doing it in a way where they also help tackle societal challenges such as floods or droughts or water purification, I think, you know, is a really worthwhile approach. And I think that's why it's pushed in policy circles that in this way, because it does really aim to try and tackle both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And so what we really need to understand is how wide scale and widespread those solutions have to be, and whether there's room in cities for nature-based solutions. I think there is, but small pockets may not be useful, and it's thinking about the scale, understanding the scale of the design of nature-based solutions in urban environments and what is feasible.
Brilliant, Constantina. I think that's a great segue into the next presentation for you. Thank you. Thanks, Laurence.